From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. In January, just after the inauguration of Donald Trump, Switchyard organized a gathering of journalists from across the country to discuss how we would go about covering the new administration. We gathered together the biographers of Michelle Obama and Mitch McConnell, authors of books about the Koch brothers and the family, about Amazon and Google and Facebook, about the rise of white supremacy and the cash value of racism. We featured writers and editors for the New York Times, the LA Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Mother Jones, for StoryCorps, This American Life, and Reveal. We also had musicians, filmmakers, novelists, essayists, and poets. As we had hoped, the gathering was a source of solace, a call to action and a chance to recommit ourselves to our values and best practices, and a rekindling of our belief in the power of storytelling in all its forms. In these unprecedented and difficult times, we are once again reporting on a president who characterizes journalists as enemies of the state and jokes about killing us. And he empowers and emboldens state and local officials to indulge their most authoritarian impulses. Here in the heart of Tulsa, on the grounds of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the end of the Trail of Tears, we have state officials who have sought to block the teaching of that history while requiring schools to buy Bibles branded with the new president's name. The solemn question each of our panels addressed: what are we going to do now? In this live episode, we hear from Jeff Charlotte and Molly O'Toole, with a response from Mazen Sadakmed. Jeff has given years to studying what he calls the slow civil war, the dividing of the country and the rise of an angry, aggrieved, alienated ultra-right wing. Molly has reported on Trump's immigration policies and their effects on migrants and their families. She's completing a book that documents her journeys alongside people traversing the Darien Gap and making their way north over hundreds and thousands of miles to the U.S. border. Mazen, who will lead the Q&A, co-founded and co-directs the groundbreaking immigration news site, Documented. Everyone, welcome in. Please come and find a seat. Thank you for joining us. Marianne, I'm glad you're here too. This is good. As you'll see, this is all going to be relatively informal and by design. The idea here is that the format is going to allow us to have brief, more formal written pieces that are shared here, but the emphasis is on conversation. You look around the room, there are some intensely smart people here, and I'm eager to hear everybody in conversation with each other. But having said that, there are some more formal introductions to do to kick things off. So first and foremost, it's my pleasure to welcome you here. Thank you all. Many of you came from a great distance. I really appreciate it. Welcome to the University of Tulsa's gathering of contributors, collaborators, and colleagues to Switchyard magazine and the Switchyard podcast. Here in this room, and joining us over the course of the next 24 hours, are the biographers of Michelle Obama and Mitch McConnell, authors of books about the Koch brothers and the family, about Amazon and Google and Facebook, about the rise of white supremacy and the cash value of racism. There are winners of the Pulitzer Prize and National Magazine Awards, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the MacArthur Fellowship. Writers and editors for the New York Times, the LA Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Mother Jones. For StoryCorps, This American Life, and Reveal. We have also with us, over the course of the next day, musicians, filmmakers, novelists, essayists, poets, and I can't say enough about the work that all of you have done. Riding the rails with hobos, crossing the border with coyotes, going undercover at Sing Sing, going undercover at a Cargill meatpacking plant. And that's just Ted Conover. The rest of you have also done really impressive work. Seriously, Every single person here is really amazing, and also scattered around in this room are some of my students in my magazine and journalism courses, and I ask those of you to take the opportunity to go around and meet your syllabus. The readings that we will be covering are mostly written by the people who are in this room. Our intention in gathering all of you together for this weekend was to bring together the smartest and kindest people that we know, to collectively reckon with what's ahead and to figure out how we can get through it together. You've heard this list of people that I just made, but let me put it another way. We've invited mentors and sources of inspiration, longtime collaborators and old friends, former students and interns, and beloved colleagues from our current positions at the university all the way back to my college roommate. And that is true. We ran the publications together. It seemed like a time to get absolutely everyone involved. On a personal note, I'm proud to say that the program here includes all of you. My teachers from Breadloaf, my successors at VQR, my editors of the New York Times, Harper's and Mother Jones, my fellow editors at Fern, who are well represented here, co-reporters and fellow fellows from the Knight Wallace and the Watchdog Writers Group, past attendees of the Between Coast conferences that Marianne and I helped to organize, editors from the new Tulsa Local News Initiative, and department colleagues from Media Studies, and of course, numerous Switchyard contributors. Looking back across decades of work life, Marianne and I decided on a group of about 50 people that we wanted to invite. That included each of you. Of the 50 people invited, more than 40 are here. Some canceled existing events in order to be here or pushed back deadlines. A few, not here, responded with regret and even anguish that they couldn't attend. They had ailing family, or had to be out of the country, or had a book due next Friday. Our thoughts are with you, Pam Colliff. But 201, they asked if they could still contribute to the print issue of where we are grappling with these issues. It means the world to me that all of you are here and engaged with all of this. And while I sent out a bunch of emails and twisted a few arms, the real work was done by Marianne Andre, our podcast producer and multimedia editor for Switchyard, and by Autumn Wharton, Heidi Hernandez, Joe Mathis, and Todd Wade at Rumble Drum. I know that many of you interfaced repeatedly with Autumn. Marianne worked with President Brad Carson to make sure we could hold this event at short notice, and then worked with the president's team to secure funding and this venue. And she worked with the church studio to make sure we can record this event for our podcast listeners. Autumn and Heidi did the never-ending work of booking your travel and hotels and getting some local partners involved. Greenwood Rising, which you saw today, the Bob Dylan Center, who are putting on the event tonight. A gathering like this is only an idea. It's just a dream without Marianne and Autumn and Heidi. I'm so grateful to them for making this into a reality. Tomorrow night in the evening, we will debut a special Switchyard video and music series that Marianne imagined and realized in partnership with the Woody Guthrie Estate, another partner. But we'll talk more about that then. For now, thanks to all the folks I've mentioned, and thanks to all of you. So, we hope this gathering will be a source of hope and maybe a little solace, but also a call to action and a chance to recommit ourselves to our values and best practices and a rekindling of our belief in the power of storytelling in all of its forms. But let's not kid ourselves. These are unprecedented and difficult times. We are once again reporting on a president who characterizes us as enemies of the state and jokes about killing us. And he empowers and emboldens state and local officials to indulge their most authoritarian impulses. Here on the grounds of the Tulsa Race Massacre, at the end of the Trail of Tears, we have state officials who have sought to block the teaching of that history while requiring schools to buy Bibles branded with the new president's name. Marianne and I are deeply grateful to all of you for making this journey to Tulsa, but we also have a solemn task ahead of us, a question that each of us must consider. What are we going to do now? So tonight, after touring Greenwood Rising, I wanted to start by taking some of these things on pretty directly. I wanted to start by hearing from Jeff Charlotte. Did Jeff make it into the room tonight? Does anyone know? I heard from Jeff. He was texting me just a little bit ago. This is going to be exciting. Molly O'Toole, who I know is here, and from Mazen Sidahmed. I'm going to have all of you come up and take your places on the stage right now. I'm also just going to text Jeff live from stage. So Jeff has spent years studying what he calls the slow civil war, the dividing of the country and the rising of angry, aggrieved, alienated, ultra-right-wing forces. I've reported on similar issues and will kick off the conversation with Jeff once he arrives. Molly has reported on Trump's immigration policies and their effects on migrants and their families. She's completing a book called The Root that I will let her explain in greater depth, but I've had the rare opportunity to hear Molly talking about that book and the incredible lengths that she's gone to report it. And Mazen Sidahmed, who will then speak after Molly, he's the co-founder and co-director of the groundbreaking immigration news site Documented. I have to tell you, Mazen and I were Knight Wallace Fellows together. He gave one of those presentations where I felt like my brain was never the same after that hour. It changed everything about the way I thought about journalism and about the kind of work we were trying to do and how we should do it. So I'm thrilled to have his voice as part of this conversation. Once we're done, we're going to throw this open for the broader conversation here. But I also wanted to give you a heads up on what happens afterwards. Those of you with lanyards, those of you who are the invitees, once we've gotten ourselves good and depressed, like solidly depressed from these conversations, we're going to break off for individual dinners, and everyone have your conversations, and please engage with the folks who took the time to come from Tulsa as well. After that, we're going to reconvene at Kane's Ballroom for the Dylan tribute concert. I wanted to remind everyone that that is in your near future because it is very much the format of what we have put together, that we want to have heavy conversations where we are taking on some serious stuff, and then we want to have some things where we remind ourselves why we're fighting, why it is that we are trying so hard to preserve this place and this culture that we care about. And that's music, that is poetry and literature, it is art, and we're going to have all of that as part of what we do here. And we'll try to have a healthy mix of all of those things along the way. The last thing that I'll remind you, and this is also for the people who may be wondering and are concerned, the format here is going to be quite simple. We have these opening statements. There's going to be a little bit of conversation among us on stage, and then at least half of every program, not just tonight, but all day tomorrow, will be open conversation. The thing that we're going for is to get all of you big brains into the same room together and let you talk to each other, and to do it as openly and as freely as we possibly can. And I doubt that we're going to come to any consensus. Even Jeff was texting me earlier saying, I'm not sure that I'm resolved on any of these issues. And I was like, man, I'm not sure that any of us are resolved on these issues, but I think it's important for us to be here talking through that and trying to figure out at least what the next step is and the one after that. So without any further ado, Jeff, I'm going to let you go first.
It's punishment. I'm so sorry to be rushing in late. And then to begin by correcting Ted, to say I am resolved on 2 points that we may all agree on, but it's even startling that I don't think we would have maybe some years ago. One, maybe actually we might not be all agreed on this. I do think the F word, fascism, historically, that historic term that refers to classical fascism between in the 20th century, this is the term to describe what we are confronting and its constituent parts. And it's been astonishing from my place in academe to watch the steady parade of scholars, one by one, their objections fall and say, no, actually, this is it. The scholars who have always said, well, but there's this detail. we're here. And I'm resolved, obviously, as I think are we all, to oppose it. But then comes the question of how and the many fronts that we confront. And I think I'm invited here to speak in terms of my experience in some decades. One of my beats as a journalist is covering what these days is called Christian nationalism, American fundamentalism, the Christian right, the long theocratic march maybe, or the theocentric march. And I backed into that beat. I never meant to cover it. It began for me on September 11th, 2001, and I had just moved into a semi-squat in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and it was very cheap, and yet it had the most fabulous view of the Twin Towers, which were gone. The view was gone. And I remember that moment because not too long after that, a friend said, my brother's coming to visit New York. He wants to see what's happening there, and I'm afraid he's joined a cult, and can you talk to him? By then, I'd been writing about religion for a while. As a younger person, as an activist in college, I had marched and hollered against the Gulf War. I had been beaten and arrested. I watched what were at that time, and maybe historians in the room would correct me, but I believe were at least some of, and maybe superlative, the largest protests in history. And the Great American War story had rolled right over them. We were not even a speed bump, and I had felt a certain hopelessness, which might also be familiar to this moment, that all our efforts amount to naught. And I had turned to writing and writing about religion and writing about things that people believe and don't believe. And so my friend said, I'm afraid that my brother has joined a cult. Will you talk to him? And I said, I'm not a deprogrammer. I can't help you, but sure, I'll meet Zeke, is the man I call him. And he came, and we walked around, and he had enjoyed, he didn't call it a cult, he called it a movement. And in fact, it wasn't even, there's nothing cult-like about it. He was working for powerful Republican congressmen. And here we are in Oklahoma. So one name that he mentioned was proud son of Oklahoma, James Inhofe. None of the Oklahomans? Maybe there's not so many Oklahomans. I see one man nodding, okay. The man who held a snowball in the Senate floor and said, see, climate change isn't real. I have a snowball. So he was working with these Republican congressmen, but they were not even as a paid person, not as a volunteer in a certain way. He said he was a follower of Jesus and that they had a plan and that he was sorry about the wreckage of New York City, which he considered sinful, but they had a plan for the future. I remember these words. He said he was there to survey the ruins of secularism, to survey the ruins of secularism. And Zeke was a prescient man. He was right. Secularism, which was an always wobbly idea going back to the Enlightenment, this idea that we might understand the world and govern ourselves according to appeals to reason. Zeke and his comrades knew that that movement, that the idea that never fully took hold, but was aspirational, was already then crumbling. I ended up writing a book about that movement, I ended up joining the movement, not as a believer, but kind of a think, I guess. I mean, I was taking notes. They saw me taking notes. I said, I'm taking notes because I think you're weird. And they were just like, yeah. I wrote a book about it, and it's called The Family. And that was a long time ago. That was 2008. And it's about a movement that is arguably the most influential Christian right organization in Washington since 1935. And it did so partly, it did not care for grandstanding. It was the opposite in style of Trumpian. So much so that when Trump came to power, I even imagined that with all its conservatism, it might in fact be more of a speed bump to Trumpism than the millions that marched against the Gulf War were to that. I was wrong. Trumpism swallowed it whole. And that movement persists, but it's just yet another auxiliary of Trumpism, which made it surprising to me when last year a Spanish publisher said, we want to publish the book now in a Spanish edition. And I'm like, that seems an odd moment. And they wanted a new prologue to account for the things that had happened since. And I put off writing the prologue. I put off writing the prologue last fall, and I put off writing it last month. And I'm glad. I'm glad because the prologue was there to say, oh, things actually got worse than you said in that book. And now here we are. If I'd written it last week, it would be out of date by now. And now I'm boiled down to, everyone's heard of Hemingway's famous 6-word story. I've got a 6-word story. Then it got worse, a lot. That's my prologue. That's my talk, except to say something about that a lot. A book I published last year, there's a chapter in it called The Great Acceleration. It was about in 22. It was in Wisconsin when Dobbs fell, and which became at that moment, for a while, the only blue state to have essentially no reproductive rights. They reverted back to 1848 or 49 law, no exceptions. So I wandered around knocking on the doors of people who were flying the flags that suggested that this to them might be a glorious moment, and spent time with them and listened to them talk about what I came to call in that book a slow civil war, which they felt was approaching. And they looked at that approach with varying degrees of sorrow, it's too bad it has to happen, or joy, a kind of quickening of the blood, a kind of excitement, which is this idea of accelerationism. These terms, Christian nationalism, when that came on the scene, you couldn't say that in a proper newspaper. You couldn't say white supremacy. You couldn't say fascism. Only last year, a New York Times political reporter, and I've been not naming him, but to hell with that now, Reed Epstein, argued with me and said, we don't use the F word or the R word, racism. We don't call people names. This was that New York Times view at that moment. But here we are, things have picked up. I wonder what Reed would say now. Probably still no F word. Maybe he'll go for the R word. Little steps. That's how we make progress. And this accelerationist idea, that was an idea. This is so recent vintage. It comes into popular usage. In 2013, a couple Marxist scholars published a document called #Accelerate Manifesto. I see you nodding. You know the document. They did not anticipate the uses to which their work would be put. Perhaps they should have when they said there's no more time for the deliberative process of democracy. We've got to speed things up. Let's rush toward the conflict. And they sounded just like those folks whose doors I was knocking on in Wisconsin and around the country as I was traveling around, following the ghost of Ashley Babbitt, a martyr of the movement, asking people what they believed about her and what they thought about this slow civil war. Well, the fascist intellectuals looked at that idea of accelerationism and they said, yes, common ground. They like this idea too. Let's speed it up. And the acceleration now is going so fast, it's hard to keep up. And I'll close with 2 examples that I'm thinking about. One is the January 6th pardons, which anyone who was paying attention knew were coming. And there's a temptation and a terrible mistake, I think, now to say, oh, well, we knew this was going to happen. No, we didn't. We knew it could happen. We did not know what shape it would be. We did not know that just days ago, as they were saying, how many, this many, according to reporting, Trump's deliberations, he said, fuck it. That was the term, fuck it. Release them all. That was easier than distinction. He also understood the spectacle that would cause. That expansion, the most expansive version, was part of the acceleration, part of the permission structure. Less covered is the fact of how many of these people who were no longer permitted to have guns, certainly not permitted to be in touch with the officials who put them in jail, have been posting on X, tomorrow I'm getting my guns back, and I'm going to pay a visit to the judge. Now, they know the line. They know that there's still a line. They're not going to say that they're going to shoot the judge, and I don't think they are. This is a moment of deep intimidation, but it's picking up. It's gone from those people in jail to those people with guns knocking on a judge's door and say, hey, can I talk with you? It's just open carry. The other moment is more personal, and it's the last one I'll close on, partly because I was checking my phone as I was coming over here to see if our new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, a man who writes in his last book that no more cold Civil War. It's time for the real thing. Has he been voted in this afternoon, as he said would be possible? But something much smaller, what did happen this afternoon is Marco Rubio, our new Secretary of State, declared that all the passports have been released that allowed you to put an X for gender and were very meaningful for non-binary folks, including my 15-year-old child who got their new passport with an X. And they are so proud of that passport, which is no longer valid. Up in the air whether it would be honored or not. If the parents among you say, I don't know how many of you would say, well, we'll take a chance. We'll see what customs says when we try and come back in the country. A small thing, but that's that acceleration. And I look at my own child astonished, already so cynical and bitter about how the world understands trans people. It's going faster than they thought. And they couldn't sleep. They stayed up all night. What is to be done? They're angry at the New York Times. They're angry at the press. They're angry at me. They're angry at all of us, the adults who did fail them, the speed bump that was not. Their conclusion was they were going to make a zine. And I thought that was a good idea because I think, and maybe this is where we can discuss, and I'll turn it over. My view in the days ahead is how do we go forward? Trump has mastered the art of the spectacle. There is no grand stand with which we can stop this. There is no women's march. My leftist friends who are talking about fighting in the streets are naive at best. There is now the slow, steady work of resistance, of asserting the true story, of risking the truth, which, talking to Ted this afternoon, I thought Tulsa is a good place, a place that has been engaged in that long struggle for so many years for us to think about how we may now expand that everywhere. Thanks.
Molly, I'll have you talk.
Oh, great.
Next.
So I get
ahead.
to follow that. Wonderful. Jeff just walks in here and just, hi, I'm Molly, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. A special thanks to Ted for gentle arm twisting, but the right kind of arm twisting. And there's so many people in this room that I admire that this is incredibly intimidating. I've also never been a VIP in my life for anything, I don't think. So I'm also well aware of the fact that I'm keeping everyone from this event. I don't feel cool enough to be in this room. So I'm an immigration reporter. It's a really boring issue. No one feels strongly about it. No one has any strong opinions. There's hardly any. No. So I've mostly covered immigration and security for the last 15 or so years. And I'm going to be dating myself here, but actually to maybe embarrass Jeff or embarrass me more, like 15 years ago, maybe, I was an intern and I got to interview Jeff about work he was doing about the family and how they were influencing anti-LGBTQ legislation and policy in Africa. And there's a connection there because I'm working on this book. It's tentatively called The Route. I actually hate that name, so bear with me on that, and has a long but just placeholder subtitle, but how American policy, a billion-dollar black market, and indomitable resilience are bringing the world's refugees to the U.S. border. I'm aware that's too long, and then that's not going to stay. But there's a connection there. There's many connections, and I think there's many connections between the work that Jeff does and mine, between this anti-immigrant movement, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and a sort of anti-government, right-wing, white nationalist, nativist movement, both of which are having their prominence around the world. But for this book, and I'll take a step back and a step forward, but for this book, I have traveled more than 30,000 miles, I think, at the last count, alongside migrants, refugees, asylum seekers from around the world who are making their way to Latin America, in fact, and then making their way up to the U.S.-Mexico border. But one person I met and traveled with for many countries, and we shared many experiences together, was a man from Ghana who was at least accused of being gay and had to flee. And Ghana was debating, and I believe the Supreme Court recently said that it could stand a law that would go even further than Uganda's, which was the work that the focus of Jeff's work at that time. So to take a step back, I sort of stumbled on this book idea and this obsession of mine about global migration. I had covered the 2016 election for Foreign Policy magazine, which is an interesting place to do it. They had never had a presidential campaign correspondent. I had never been a presidential campaign correspondent. It was a one-person team up against CNN's 200. And trying to cover foreign policy in an American election when Americans purport to care about foreign policy, but they don't tend to vote on foreign policy. And then, of course, the election ended up being Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. So I covered the election as best I could under those circumstances. And right after the election in November of 2016, just a few weeks after, I went on a trip to southern Mexico on the border with Guatemala. And it's a town called Tapachula where 99.99% of people who are migrating, trying to make their way to the U.S., they pass through this town. And I thought I was going to be reporting on what was really actually an Obama administration initiative, which the idea was to push the U.S.-Mexico border outward, to have the southern border of Mexico and Guatemala become the U.S.-Mexico border and sort of outsource immigration enforcement, essentially, and keep moving that border outward to prevent people from reaching that sort of magical dirt on the U.S.-Mexico border that triggers access to asylum. I thought I was going to be speaking primarily with Mexicans and Central Americans about this idea. Plan Frontera Sur was the concept. And I went to a hostel, and it had been renamed Mama Africa. The proprietor was Mexican, and she had learned how to make all of these dishes, jollof rice and suya, because she was catering to this new clientele. And I spent all day talking to people from Somalia, from Ethiopia, from Eritrea, from Cameroon. And I thought, wow, this is it. And it challenged conceptions that I had, who's supposedly an immigration reporter, about who is coming to the United States, how they're coming to the United States, why they're coming to the United States. And I think the U.S. has tended to think of itself as being geographically or geopolitically, socially, economically isolated from, oh, that happens over there. The conflicts happen over there. The refugee crises happen over there. They don't happen here. And to me, each one of these people was challenging that idea that the U.S. is no longer isolated from this record global displacement that we're seeing. So I was obsessed with it and tried to get everyone to let me write about it ever since. I was like, this is going to be big. This is going to be huge, because there's almost nothing to stop it. When displaced people around the world have discovered that as legal pathways narrow and close down, both in Europe and the United States, Latin America, in fact, has some of the most liberal visa policies in the world. So this route has been created for a combination of reasons. So then I covered the Department of Homeland Security under the Trump administration. And just to take a very brief step back, and then I'll step forward and I'll stop talking because I want to do the listening here. There are 120 million people displaced around the planet. This is record global displacement that we've never seen. That's 1 in every 69 people, I think, on Earth. It's like 1.5% of the Earth's population. So not just record global displacement, but it's also accelerating. So we have 50 million more migrants today than we had just 10 years ago. 2023 was 24 million displaced just in that year alone. And up the previous decade, I think the average had been 14 million. And then it's also protracted. So there's this idea, okay, refugees, they eventually will go home. And that's very much no longer the case. You have more than 60% of the displaced population that have been displaced for 5 years or more, which is considered protracted. And I think counter to what we're hearing in our politics and in the rhetoric in the United States especially is, yes, there is this record global displacement. 70% of people will stay close by, and 75% of the globally displaced are hosted by low-income countries, middle and low-income countries. So actually, the high-income countries, such as the United States, the wealthiest in the world, only host about 25%. So what has been the political response to this global displacement in both Europe and the United States? It's been a hardening of deterrence policies. It's been nativist politics. But what my book is about and what it focuses on is that has in fact been counterproductive. Because this is what I've learned on buses, crawling around through the mud between Colombia and Panama, following migrants, following smugglers, witnessing corrupt officials who've been paid by the United States to stop migrants, take money from the migrants, take money from the smugglers, and also take money from the United States. You can't stop people from moving. This is the world that we are increasingly living in. And we live on a refugee planet. So given that you can't stop people from moving, where do you go from there? If you restrict legal pathways, as the United States has done, what you do is you incentivize people to take more irregular, dangerous routes. It increases their reliance on smugglers. That money ultimately goes to transnational criminal organizations and corrupt officials, which undermines the democratic institutions in those countries, creates more instability, which in and of itself also fuels more migration. And then the last thing that I'll say is that the sort of weaponization of immigration, weaponization of human bodies on the move is about power. And I think that's where there's more overlap and between Jeff's work and my own. And the anti-immigrant movement has always been about power. And what do I mean when I say that? Appealing to the basest human instinct of the other, of the us versus them, or it's really quite an American instinct. It's been a long tradition in this country and how our immigration policy and law have evolved. And then increasingly in this post 9/11 world, when everything becomes security, which is sort of a golden calf in Washington especially. So as the Trump administration has done and people around Trump, it's portraying immigrants as a threat, portraying immigrants as an existential threat, immigrants as an invasion, immigrants as terrorists. Now, I've seen 4 generations of an Afghan family, from the mother to the children to the children's children, all the way down to the babies crawling through the Darien Gap. Now, if you want to tell me that that family is a security threat, I think there's no evidence to suggest that that's the case. Poor, desperate families from around the world. But what it does is it creates this dynamic of fear It creates this dynamic of, well, if there's an existential threat and this is about survival, then here's all the power. Here's all the power without any accountability. Here's a blank check to do what you need to do to protect us, to have this savior idea. And this has been a steady campaign and a steady strategy from the Trump administration. I think for all the reasons I mentioned, they're going to face the same challenges that previous administrations have before them, and the same answers are not going to be sufficient. For the last 40 or so years, Congress has completely abdicated its responsibilities when it comes to especially this area of immigration. But where I'm going with that in terms of this abdication of responsibility is because of that, the executive has basically taken a lot of space. And this concerted effort and strategy from the Trump administration to portray immigration as a threat has also led to obviously a politicization, but also a polarization and a weaponization of the instruments of government, of the instruments of power. And it's gearing all of them toward this threat. Part of what happens here is it's about going after the most vulnerable people. There's an assumption here that's not always incorrect, that the American public will support restrictionist, draconian policies if they're directed toward an other, if they're directed toward an immigrant, if they're directed toward a non-citizen. But eventually those same tactics could be used against anyone, U.S. citizens, civil servants, for example, political opponents, anyone who disagrees with my way of thinking. And there's just a few quick examples that I want to point to from covering Trump administration 1.0. You'll remember in 2018, when a migrant caravan was coming to the border, Trump called it an invasion and said we need to deploy the military. And so he did deploy the military in 2018. And that mission for the U.S. military has continued. So even if the Biden administration ended the national emergency, the Biden administration kept the military at the border, which essentially was reaffirming this idea that we need the military to protect us against this invasion of immigrants. CBP, in order to respond to a situation in Tijuana in Southern California, used tear gas against families, which was against the use of force policies. They also used an audio tool that was supposed to be used for crowd dispersement. It can actually cause deafness. And of course, retroactively, the inspector general says, okay, you weren't supposed to use that, et cetera, et cetera. That same tool was also used for the George Floyd protests in 2020. And some of those same in 2020, even though you saw hesitation to use the military to respond to those protests, you saw BORTAC, which is sort of the special forces of Customs and Border Protection, and you saw CBP officers and others who were part of the Department of Homeland Security in plain clothes, pulling protesters into vans. So this is just an example, I think, of this idea. It's about power. It's about holding on to power. It's about being unaccountable to the law, but also to the public. And what starts with this sort of anti-immigrant movement and what starts there will eventually be used, I think, to suppress dissent, to suppress freedom of speech, right to protest, a variety of rights that we ostensibly hold dear. I think that's what's ahead for us. So I think the question is, will we respond differently this time?
Thank you. I want to get to Mazen very quickly here, but I want to say that in some of my thinking on all of this, I've spent probably the last 15 years reporting more or less at the intersection of white supremacy and how that fits into anti-immigrant policies at various levels. And that reporting really started in a small town in Nebraska, Fremont, Nebraska, where what at the time seemed like sort of crazy policies were being set at the local level that legislated against people being able to live in certain places, being able to rent, being able to work based on a licensing procedure that was put in place by the town that required proof of citizenship. It seemed utterly not only extremist, but sort of novel and like an outlier at the time. The lawyer who was representing the town in that case was Chris Kobach, who later turned out to be the architect of many of Trump's policies in the first term. The thing, though, that I wanted to talk about that I mentioned at the top, that Mazen had this talk that he gave a few years ago that changed my brain forever. Part of that was how it echoed this discomfort that I had had for years and years and years reporting in some of these places. I had discomfort on the one hand that I was doing this reporting primarily for Harper's and for the New Republic. And some of the way that that work was rather easily carried out is that, as it turns out, white supremacists in Fremont, Nebraska do not read Harper's or the New Republic and don't care what you say in the pages of those magazines. On the one hand, that made the reporting extremely easy. And on the other hand, I was constantly aware that this was not penetrating those information bubbles at all. I was going in and was reporting on this world, but this was having absolutely zero effect. It was as if it was not happening. And I can remember one particular moment. Ted Ross, who's here in the room, was my editor on this piece, interviewing a guy that, as I'd covered Fremont over the years, the movement that the white supremacist groups there kept getting more and more overtly Christianized as part of this. And the Christian rhetoric became more and more part of it. And I remember sitting with one of the people I was interviewing about this and asking him, like, okay, so there's this Christian sheen to everything that you're doing. But what do we say about Christian teaching, about welcome the stranger and this sort of thing? And he thought about it a second and he said, this is a tough one. Because on the one hand, that teaching is clear. And on the other hand, God put a border between the United States and Mexico. And I remember just sitting there for a minute, kind of taking that in and thinking, man, how do you argue against this? Like, we're not operating in the same informational environments. So that bothered me on the one hand. And at the same time, many of the people that I was also reporting on and continue to report on are people who are in some of these communities because they work at meatpacking plants. They are the newest arrivals in the United States, often having arrived here under harrowing circumstances. And the work that I've done, and often done with Marianne Andre, my wife, and who also does absolutely everything else that there is to do with the reporting, from the photography, the videography, the audio reporting that she's done on a piece that we've got coming out next week on all of this. What we've seen again and again is that we get into these communities and we are in some ways as invisible to those groups as we are to the groups of white supremacists. We're very often collecting the stories, trying to tell these stories, but it doesn't make it back into those communities either. And that's what I was so thrilled by when I heard all the work and how you were thinking about the work that you're doing, Mazen, that documented, which seems to me a kind of important leap forward in how we think about doing some of this work and thinking about it. So I'm hoping that you'll speak back to what we've heard here, but also tell us about that work and about that concept as well. And then we'll open it to questions.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Thank you so much for having me, Ted. And this is a new world for me. I'm not usually in this literary world, so I'm just honored to be here and so many amazing writers here. And I'm fans of both of your work, so really happy to be here. And I wish I shared your resolve. I actually am in a moment of really struggling to find what we're going to do moving forward, actually. This new administration has really brought into question a lot of the things that you and I, Ted, have spoken about, and that you just mentioned in that talk, that how we've structured our news organization, documented the way that we've thought about our work, the re-election of Donald Trump and the way that it happened and played out in New York City has really brought into question the very fundamentals of how we do our work. So I can back up a little bit just to give you some context about who we are and what we do. So I'm one of the co-founders and co-executive directors of Documented. We are a nonprofit newsroom that covers New York City's immigrant communities. And the point that Ted was alluding to is that when we launched the site, we had what we thought was a very simple mission, which was we wanted to make sure that we were writing for immigrant communities and not about immigrant communities. We, both my co-founder and I, Max, had been reporters in the Middle East covering immigration for some years. I'd been a reporter at The Guardian for a few years before that as well. And both of us had these experiences where we go spend the entire day with someone. I was a reporter in Lebanon at the peak of the Syrian refugee crisis. I'd go to a refugee camp, spend the whole day with somebody, and they would be so generous. I would hear really heartbreaking stories. I speak Arabic, and I'd have a really intimate moment with this person. Then I'd go back to my office in Beirut, and I'd write a story in English, and that person would never engage with that story. They'd never really have a relationship with it. And that relationship always felt very extractive to me. So in 2017, when the idea for Documented started to formulate, Max and I were committed to making sure that Documented wouldn't be like that we would actually ensure that the people at the center of the stories were also the people reading the stories. We thought it would be very simple. We figured we would just translate the stories from English to Spanish. We're amazing journalists. The work is great. The only issue was language access. That was our understanding, is that we just needed to do a better job of translation. But what we learned over time is that actually the fundamentals of what we consider to be news needed to change if we were going to actually engage with the immigrant communities that we wanted to serve. So this question of who is your journalism for has become an obsession of ours ever since we started the site, and has fundamentally changed me as a journalist. So in 2018, we actually went out to undocumented Spanish speakers in New York, and we asked people, what kind of news do you consume? What kind of news do you find interesting? What do you think of the existing media landscape? Where do you get your news currently? And we came back with three main findings at that time. Number one, people felt that they were always either portrayed as victims or criminals in the news, which is a very common feedback the marginalized communities give about their coverage in the news. Number two, people actually wanted actionable information about where to get resources that can help them navigate New York City better. And finally, people were getting most of their news through informal WhatsApp groups. So a family group, a church group, a block association. So we launched a WhatsApp news service where we distribute the news, a newsletter once a week in Spanish, a roundup of links that we figured would be interesting to the community, and opened up a two-way dialogue between us and the communities that we wanted to reach and serve. Over time, that grew into a really vibrant group that has become the engine of our newsroom. So we're in constant two-way communication, and then the things that we're hearing on WhatsApp drive our editorial decisions. So the stories that we're publishing in Spanish are now actually stories that people want to consume. They're not the type of journalism that people assume immigrants would be interested in. And we took that model and we replicated it for Chinese immigrants in New York and Caribbean immigrants in New York. So we run almost 3 publications, one in Spanish, one in Chinese, it's mainly on WeChat, and one for Caribbean New Yorkers, it's mainly on Nextdoor. And we use those to get a pulse for the community and understand where they're at. And it has been really successful, and it's been an amazing experience for me as a reporter. We have these incredible community correspondents, each one dedicated to each community, each one from the community that they're serving. And then we have beat reporters that are doing cross-community coverage about labor, wage theft, immigration enforcement, and translating that into the different languages. But about 2 years ago, to your point, Governor Greg Abbott started busing migrants to New York City. And this has fundamentally changed the politics of New York City, the complexion of the city, and the leanings of the communities that we currently serve. So for people that aren't familiar, this was basically a stunt by Greg Abbott, throwback to the Jim Crow era, where he started busing migrants from the border to liberal cities to be like, you think you can handle this, see what it's like when it's on your doorstep. And the liberal cities really, New York, Chicago, Washington, played right into Greg Abbott's hands. And there was just absolute hysteria from the mayor of New York and Chicago and others. And after time, some people started hearing about this, migrants that were coming to Texas, and started coming of their own accord. So not everybody was being bused by Abbott. And over about 2 years, there was about 250,000 people came to New York City through these buses that would come to Port Authority. Now, New York has what's called a right to shelter law, where everybody's entitled to a bed. Everybody's entitled to shelter in New York City. That's why you don't see big tent cities in New York like you do on the West Coast, even though there's a huge amount of homelessness in New York. And these shelters, basically the capacity hit very quickly in the established shelters. So new shelters were being built all around New York. And this created a lot of tension within the immigrant communities that we serve, to the point where we have now seen a huge shift in anti-immigrant sentiment across New York, not just amongst, liberals or people who leaned conservative previously, but among migrants who are often from the same places that a lot of the people that are coming from are. And we've seen a new complexion of immigrant communities, as Molly was saying, of a huge new West African community coming to New York. So in this past election, New York took a huge swing towards Trump. And it was mainly driven by the communities that we serve. So we've seen in the Chinese immigrant community that is a big part of our audience, just a rising anti-immigrant sentiment. We've covered huge protests against shelters that were being established in communities. We did a poll of our WeChat readers in the summer, and 2/3 said that they were going to vote Republican in November. And they did. They were not kidding. They did vote in large numbers for Trump in the last election. And we went out, we had reporters going out on election day and speaking to migrants. And our Spanish community correspondent, Romel, was in Queens, one of the most diverse places in America. And he spoke to many people there who were voting for Trump, despite the fact that they had undocumented people in their families. They believed that the Trump administration wasn't going to target their families because they were law-abiding in every other way. So how do we continue this model that we have where we want to be led by the community? We want to take cues from the community when a lot of the people that we're serving are now leaning towards Trump and often supporting a lot of the policies that are harming a lot of other members in the community. And that's a challenge that I'm hoping to unpack here over the next few days as we think about the work that we do. And in parallel to that, the myriad of threats and concerns and rapid response work that's happening right now in New York City, and the people that are reaching out to us on WhatsApp and WeChat, how do we keep pace with that at the same time?
Thank you. So I want to open this up to questions. I know that there's a mic circulating so that you can ask your questions and be heard. Despite the sort of formality that comes with being handed a microphone and all of that, I do want to try to keep this as much of just an open discussion as possible. Look, I know you all, I consider you all very close friends. I'm also amazed every time I hear you talk in a setting like this. I'm like, wow, these people are super smart. So I'm just excited for the opportunity to have questions that touch on any part of the policy, how we go about reporting this, anything that interests you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for hosting this event. And what a brilliant start that was. My name is Brad Luna. I'm a 99 graduate of the University of Tulsa. I have not been downtown in quite a while. I live in Chicago now after 16 years in DC and Philadelphia. And wow, it has changed. Definitely the heartbeat of the city. I had the honor of being President Carson's press secretary when he went by another title, congressman in Congress, and then ran his 2004 U.S. Senate campaign against Tom Coburn, who is a proud member of that Christian right movement, and then at the Human Rights Campaign as a communications director afterwards, working on LGBT issues. Spent the last 25 years doing social justice work on the public relations side for national organizations, these issues. And I hate to start this with being the curmudgeon in the room to journalists, but not at the reporter level or at the editor level, but at the C-suite level. The quote that haunts me the most today, it's a Les Moonves quote from 2016 when he said, Donald Trump may be bad for America, but he's great for CBS. And I have seen over the course of my career, over the last 25 years, that corporatization of media and the driving of ratings on TV, readership in print, which is dwindling, and then now the clickbait online, and how that has driven stories forward that were outsized, and the creation of, I think a lot of that falls the responsibility of those C-suite executives at the mainstream media in 2016 of this Donald Trump. And then after we saw January 6th, when that megaphone was pulled away, where his numbers went. So I sort of have two questions. One is, how do you advocate inside of a corporate media structure to really look at these things in a way that is good for democracy and not just good for ratings? The grassroots starts on the inside. I mean, the media are our voice as citizens. And then second is, he has the megaphone now. So what do? You have to cover things. You can't just let things not happen. But as journalists, where do you see the road forward in the coverage of those things in a way that doesn't tear us down as a country, but actually helps build us up, or at least holds people accountable and responsible?
So I actually want to start by echoing and then let you all jump in, but echoing exactly what you're saying, because for many years, the space that I've occupied as an editor is to take advantage of the certain things that the big news organizations didn't want to do. Things that were too long, things that were too personal, whatever, but that felt important. And there was a way to always build a space for a small magazine to fill that niche. And it always felt like it was a reasonable thing to do, to say these people have a large platform when they're writing for the LA Times or for Vanity Fair or for The Guardian or whatever. And then if there's something that is slightly ill-fitting, that we can provide a space for that too, and they still have an audience. And their own audience will come with them, and we've created a space for that work. What has happened now, with everything being so incredibly consolidated, is that that upper level is, in my experience, getting a little bit narrower and narrower over time. And it is harder and harder for the small venues to get that work out and find an audience. And in the meantime, it is remarkable to watch the expertise that the Trump camp and many of the people who now control the social media channels that are at his back have. So I want to echo this exact question. Like, there's the work, and we talk about being able to do the work. But again, Mazen, one of the things that I think is so amazing about the work that you've done is saying, well, we're going to make brand new media channels. To me, thinking about using Nextdoor as a way of getting journalism out still like makes my brain hurt. I can't even tell you, but I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, what we know for sure is that doing the same thing over and over again as our audiences get smaller and smaller is probably not the solution.
Yeah, Nextdoor is like 90% blurry videos of people stealing packages. So we're trying to
the other 10% is your journalism.
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to like play in that 10% space. Exactly. But no, I think it's a great question. I think to give you a little bit of hope, I think there's a lot of amazing things happening right now in the nonprofit space in media. There's a movement bubbling across the country. Tulsa is at the forefront of that movement with the Tulsa Local News Initiative. But there are incredible independent nonprofit newsrooms popping up across the US constantly. There was a huge commitment from a bunch of philanthropists, I think around $500 million over the next 5 years, to invest in local news across the US. They do have an audience challenge, I'll be honest. They aren't as well known in their local communities as you would like, but they're growing. And they're really not just rebuilding in the ashes of the old dead newspapers, but reimagining what journalism could be and who it should be for, and rewriting the rules of journalism in the ways, similar ways to what we're trying to do at Documented. So I think that it's not all doom and gloom as far as the future of the media landscape, but what you say about the information ecosystems, as you were saying, that the right is so much better at it, I do think that we just have a more difficult narrative burden. Like, if you're not bound by the truth, it is very easy to do well in social media. Not just that, I just think that fear, it plays a lot better. It's easier to generate a large audience because of the way the algorithms are structured in social media and because of the way our cable news infrastructure is set up, that it just is a lot easier to do that than it is if you're trying to put forward a message of progress and hope and cohesion and all these different things. So I think there's an appeal that people have that maybe you can just build a left-wing version of Fox News or something that can be a counterweight. But I just think there's something infrastructure-wise that does make that difficult. And I think what we're saying is that you need to go person by person, really listen to people, try and understand what their information needs are, try and get into the places where people are. It takes a lot more work, but we feel like that's the best way to approach it.
Can I add something on that? I'm so excited to learn. I'm not even on Nextdoor. And there's journalism there waiting for me, right? But I'm very excited too about all these small things. And I would say even smaller. I think the moment now is, as I say, there's no grandstand to be taken. Even if you could build a left-wing Fox, which you can't because it is structurally a right-wing thing, it would take time. So we do these small things. But the one thing I would say is that it's really troubling me right now amongst our fellows in the left or liberalism and so on is how quickly we are picking up, going from media criticism to anti-journalism that begins with Trumpism, and how I'm hearing the exact same rhetoric. So we go from my deep frustration with, say, that New York Times reporter, this New York Times reporter is doing lousy stuff. Here's these headlines. Here's what they're platforming. To the New York Times is trying to get Trump elected. to, there's a reporter named Eric Lipton, who is a good reporter. Prickly character, but good reporter. Really good investigative reporter. And he let his prickliness show on Blue Sky. He says, look, here's 10 tough reporting stories that we did no one's talking about. That wasn't the way to do it. His response seemed to be overwhelmingly that he was a Nazi. And I try to say, look, that guy, I've had run-ins with him. He's difficult, but he's a really good reporter. Oh, you're an apologist for the New York Times. You're a Nazi. And it's a complete, probably not in this room, but I think the antidote to that, a pox on all of it, is the work that you're doing. And even identifying, even within those big organizations, the many, many bylines. Like, that's one thing. If you don't read the bylines, then you need to work on your media literacy and to understand who is this person? Where are they coming from when they report that story?
I want to jump in too really quick. I know we want to get to more questions, but and not exactly pox in all your houses, but like I mentioned, I covered the 2016 presidential campaign. I hope to never cover a presidential campaign ever again. Policy reporting, policy is people, to the extent that we can really focus on policy and human beings. And I think the media is also guilty. This becomes a little bit of a chicken and egg, but I think the media is also guilty of getting caught up in this circus, in this political circus, horse race, predictive, everything is politics, where every nut graph, which is supposed to be what is the most important thing, it's what does this mean for the next election? I mean, I think we are also guilty of this. And in 2016, I came away from that thinking, okay, the media screwed up here. We allowed ourselves to be manipulated. Whatever you think of Trump's political positions, he would say the most ridiculous, inflammatory thing possible. The TV networks, but everyone else also would cut away from anything else that was happening. Even if you were quoting what he said and pointing out that it was racist or xenophobic or incorrect, or if you were fact-checking it, it didn't matter because it gave more oxygen. It essentially sealed his nomination. When you might imagine, if anyone remembers, when he came down the escalator, there was a little bit like, well, this is ridiculous. This is the guy from The Apprentice. There's no way he's going to be able to win the nomination for the Republican Party. So I think the media was guilty of not realizing the degree to which, or coming up with an effective strategy to essentially being manipulated to give Trump a bullhorn for whatever it was that he was saying, to give him all the oxygen. And then in 2024, we did it again. And 2020 in some regards, again. And the media did it again. And it's easy for me to sit outside here because I was working on a book during the 2024 campaign. But I don't have the answer, personally. I don't feel like I have the answer to how does the media effectively respond when it's not about Republican or Democrat. It's about one side is lying and is not beholden to the truth, and the other side feels as if they are beholden to the truth. We, as journalists, are beholden to the truth. So how do we cover people who are not necessarily beholden to the truth? I don't know if we have a good answer to that yet. And I worked for one of these dying newspapers. I love the Los Angeles Times. I'm sure you're all aware of, maybe you're not, of where the LA Times has gone. And I left in 2023. We're now to the point where the owner has talked about putting a bias meter on the articles. And who determines the bias? Well, it's going to be an algorithm, and like it's going to be AI, right? And this is the bias meter that needs to go on news articles, by the way, not on the other side. I am encouraged by these nonprofits. I mean, I've had people ask me questions, especially immigrants that I've met, and I will point them to Documented. Documented is an absolutely essential news source for me. I mean, I think ProPublica is incredible as well. I mean, I think there's a lot of hope in the nonprofit model. We still need to grapple with, how do we make the internet make money? We still need to grapple with, how do you convince people that journalism is worth paying for, that it is an important public good, it's an important public service, it's an institution of democracy in this country, because the nonprofits are struggling with that as well. So, okay, yes, it's a nonprofit. It may not be beholden to the same corporate, but nonprofits have to fundraise. The money has to come from somewhere. Good journalism, good storytelling, it costs money. And I just want to say really quickly, I was an immigration reporter for the LA Times covering the Department of Homeland Security under Trump. And this was after being abroad for a few years. I wrote story after story after story, and it's my own personal obsessions about these pretty in the weeds policy details. Immigration policy is complicated. I think that's also part of what makes it difficult to cover and resist these simplified narratives in the rhetoric about immigration. Then I had the opportunity to do a podcast with This American Life about the same policy I'd been writing about, Remain in Mexico, which died and then came back and then died and now is back again. This American Life is amazing, and they're geniuses of audio journalism, and just watching them work, I swear there's a point here, was amazing. I thought, well, this isn't really going to resonate with anyone because they know about this already. And nothing was really breaking through on immigration under the Trump administration except for family separation. But there's a reason for that. But there was so much else going on and nothing was really breaking through. Millions of people listened to that episode. It got unbelievable outcry and ended up winning the first ever Pulitzer Prize in audio. And what people told me is the difference of hearing asylum officers talk about what it was like to implement these policies, hearing people who were afraid of getting kidnapped because of the policy they'd been subjected to, and then getting kidnapped and the audio from the kidnappers, hearing it is what allowed it to break through. So all I'm trying to say is I think we haven't answered some of these questions, but I think there are new and interesting models for the storytelling remains important. We need to be more creative about how we're telling those stories.
Hey, I'm Brent Cunningham. I'm the executive editor of the Food and Environment Reporting Network. And I wanted to go back to Ted's point about who our audience is, because 8 years ago, when Trump was elected the first time, Ted and some others started this gathering, the predecessor to this, called Between the Coasts. And at the time, the idea was how it was to bring journalists from the coasts together with journalists and other academics and stuff in the middle of the country and figure out how to better tell the stories of the people who voted for Trump. And we had faith that if we could tell those stories, they would break through and people would hear them. What I'm hearing now and what I knew coming here today is that almost everybody in this room is working for an outlet that tens of millions of people in this country either don't know about, don't care about, or don't trust. And I listened to what Mazen was saying. It's interesting. It's sort of a 21st century update on civic journalism,
Yes.
which was a movement in the 90s where mainstream newspapers and other outlets wanted to have that two-way conversation with their communities and have that help set some of the priorities for coverage. What happened to that movement, which I covered as a media critic back then, was that you ended up with a lot of news you can use, a lot of things that didn't ever begin to get at the huge systemic problems that we're all talking about and that need to be addressed. It used to be we had to deal with apathy among consumers. Apathy's still there, but now you've got all these channels of misinformation. You've got all this outright lying by public officials. So I really think that when you started talking about it, I leaned to my friend here. I said, this is the crux of everything that we're talking about here this weekend. It's like we can tell the best stories in the world. We could do it. And if that many people are not paying attention or not caring, I don't know what you do. And it's very frustrating.
I appreciate what you're saying. And I think that it's an ecosystem approach. I think that the problem that I sometimes run into is that in the US, this isn't such an issue in the UK, although you can tell I'm from the UK. Everyone in the UK is very open about who they're writing for, what their politics are, where they stand. They're not trying to write for everybody. But I think American journalists, quite noble, want to believe that their reporting should be read by the entire nation and that everybody is going to engage with everything that they write. And it's just never been true. But I think the newspapers allowed you to live in a fallacy that if I publish something on the front page, everyone in New York City is going to read it. When in reality, everybody was always sliced up. And now the internet has just given us a granular level of detail of the age and background and social security number of every reader that you have on your website. So it's just given us a more realistic view of how the media was always being consumed by the public. And I think that the civic journalism, where it plays a role, is that I think that a lot of the commercially driven journalism is never really prioritizing the needs of poor people and the things that they need in their day-to-day lives. And we want to take it a step further and start to do what we've done already around wage theft and other issues, accountability journalism that's building off of what you're hearing from the community. But I think that this idea that you as a reporter are like doing a disservice if you're not being read by everybody, I think everyone just needs to disabuse themselves of that and not do this self-flagellation that I think a lot of American journalists often fall into, which is just, it's okay. I love to criticize the New York Times as much as everyone else, you know. It's a fun sport. Yeah, and I pay for it and I read it and it's useful and they play a very important role in democracy and society, and I'll continue to criticize them, but we need them there. When I hear New York Times reporters saying they want to write for immigrant communities, I'm like, you will have to constitutionally change everything about the New York Times in order to do that. And you don't need to do that. We're here to do that. We're going to try and fill that void. The New York Times is playing an important role. I do think if you're starting a new newsroom now, you do have to ask yourself, I say that there's like an information affluent class in the US of like the highly educated that have just a plethora of options of news for them day to day. And if you're starting a new publication, asking yourself, am I really filling a void here? Or is what I'm doing just like a version of what the New York Times and the Washington Post is already offering society currently? So that would be a question that I'd ask myself. But if you're currently at a publication and it's being read, but it's having an impact, I think just being cold and honest with yourself about who your readers are can avoid a lot of the soul searching and complexity that happens. And then surveying the landscape and seeing how we can maybe support other people that are already filling those voids.
I'll take that even just a step further. And as I was coming down here yesterday, I was thinking about what I wanted to say. And I reached out to a friend of mine, and I forgot to ask her if I could use her name, so I'm not going to. But she's a children's book author. She's a political person, a children's book author. And as such, that means she's quite on the front lines of this moment. A book of hers that 10 years ago used to be a book that the Republican First Lady of her state would take around to schools and read is now banned in many school districts in that state. And yet she makes her living going around to schools, getting invited into these small places. And her thinking, which is sort of mirroring mine, which is what you're asking for, Brad, right, it's not going to happen, never happened, but really now is not the time it's going to happen. We're going to go through something big. So instead of thinking about who's reading it, we think about what we're making. Instead of, you risk the truth in all the different ways, whether as a podcast, and that becomes a way of telling a story, or suddenly next door becomes a way of telling a story. And her line, which I really liked, and might rub a room full of journalists wrong, she says, make things as if nobody's going to care about them. Because that's how you make art, and I think journalism as well, in a time of fascism. We don't have control of those levers. We can't contend for them. They would love for us to contend for them because it's just going to be Lucy with a football pulling it away from us again and again and again. Instead, you're not trying to kick that football at Documented. Right. You're making something else. And I think so smaller.
I would also add that the Food and Environment Reporting Network, where Brent works and where Ted Ross is, and I should also say where I am working for each of them as well now, has what I think is a really fascinating approach that has just been announced and formalized with trying to take reporting that is supported from this idea of like, this is reporting that we care about. This is a story that we think is important, an area of investigation that we think is important. But then we're going to have the people who are doing it go out and try to place that work in a lot of different formats and a lot of different places. I mentioned the reporting that Marianne and I have been doing together. So far, that has shown up as an op-ed in the New York Times, an op-ed in the Washington Post, the stuff in Politico magazine. We've got a version of that coming out in Mother Jones as an hour-long radio program for Reveal, a short radio piece that was Harvest Public Media and NPR. There's still stuff that's in the works with Esther Honig doing stuff for 99% Invisible, but also for High Country News. Jen Son is here in the room. And all of that is based around the same reporting. But it is a big enough story that we're working on that there are ways of approaching it for different audiences and different venues and trying to hit different people. And some of that is very regional and very local. Some of it is aimed at big national audiences. And I'm really struck by this idea too of the value of being able to hear the voices that I've had going through right now, the process of essentially doing the same story for Mother Jones and for Reveal at the same time. It's fascinating to me to see all the nuance and detail and policy specificities that can go into the print piece that just wouldn't work in an audio format, but then also what it means to be able to hear people's voices, to hear people cry, to hear people laugh ironically at something that has been alleged. It's a different way of reaching people. And even something in this case where the stories hew so closely in their narrative strategies and the same characters and all that sort of thing, the experience of them is so different. So I do think that there's some value in also not just thinking of our work as being for one particular part of an ecosystem, but that we can do a reported project with the support from the nonprofit world and then take it out and keep packaging it in different ways to reach different audiences.
Yeah, we spent a lot of the last year reporting with The City. The City is a local newsroom with an amazing investigative team. And we have these ties in the Chinese community. So The City got wind that Mayor Adams was doing campaign finance fraud, basically, and collecting straw donations from within the Chinese community. So we have a Chinese community correspondent who has deep ties in the community, and we're able to complement their reporting with our community connections. And we would never be able to do the type of investigative reporting that they did, the type of data research, the request, everything that they were able to do, and the sources that they have. So that complementary approach of like each one bringing their own muscle, I think is a way that an ecosystem can accomplish what you've said well. And Chinese immigrants in the city were like, none of the other Chinese publications would ever touch a story like that. A lot of them have very deep ties to the Adams administration, and a lot of what they're asking from us is independent investigative journalism. That's what they want from Documented, and that's what we're delivering, and it worked very well in that instance.
Take one more, and then we'll continue this conversation with all of us collapsed in and closing the gap here in just a second. So please.
Okay. Yeah. I've been sitting here wondering whether I should ask this question. It might not be a good idea, but I'm going to
definitely.
go ahead and do it anyway.
Then you have to ask it.
My name is JC Hallman, and I guess this question is primarily for Jeff. When you said that you've just spoken to a children's book author, that I thought, okay, I actually have to ask this question. But I'm thinking about the work of a writer named Lydia Mariah Child from the 19th century. She was a prominent abolitionist, author of 50-odd books, and she gave us the lines, "Over the river and through the woods to grandfather's house we go." That's her. But she was also a fire-breathing abolitionist and saw it through the period of nonviolence for decades, and then ultimately in the years leading up to the Civil War. And just after the raid on Harper's Ferry, Lydia Mariah Child published a pamphlet of an exchange of letters she had with some people. And in this pamphlet, she said this: "In this enlightened age, all despotisms ought to come to an end by the agency of moral and rational means. But if they resist such agencies, it is in the order of providence that they must come to an end by violence." And given the fact that we're still alive today, Lydia Mariah Child might very well be sitting in this room with us. And given that we're now using the F word, at what point should it fall on writers and authors to take a different stance when it comes to the question of political violence?
I've actually been having that conversation with a lot of people, and for a variety of reasons and biographical over time. I'm committed to nonviolence, but I don't preach it. And I know activists who have embraced actions that they are saying are not violent, but others, if you've ever had a rock thrown through your window, it feels pretty violent. So I'm not actually persuaded by the argument that that's just property damage. It's not violence. It's violence. But maybe you can make the case for that if you want. And then there's people who are outright saying this is what we need to do. And there's sort of the pragmatic response, which is that's a fascinating case, well past the point. There is no capacity for that level of resistance right now. The violence, the Civil War that threatens, and what's fascinating to me is this is another, talk about a journalism failure, the failure of military reporting. And the fact that most newsrooms have very few people who understand the military. My first job was covering courts martial, and I had some sense. I wouldn't call myself a military reporter even then. So when everyone's saying, are these militias going to start a civil war and so on, there's all these retired flag officers, senior officers saying the military is not monolithic and we have a real problem. And that under normal circumstances, you may have a colonel and he may have some crackpot ideas, but he's really great at getting the jeeps where they need to be. Now you have, if you get to a point of a chain of command dispute, which we might have had Harris won, that's where you risk civil war. Well, we didn't get there. So I feel like maybe this is an easy out, the violence question, which I am opposed to, but it's also a moot question. And I will advocate that I think, because I hear a lot of talk in organizing circles about arming up 400 million guns in civilian hands. A lot of them aren't just people, I'm a gun owner, it doesn't mean anything. But there's not enough, if you've heard of the John Brown clubs, there's not enough John Brown clubs to catch up with what's there or to catch up with even a small city police department. I think so much of the question of violence, which was in the 19th century now, is a 19th century question, which is to say there's a romance of it and there's a fantasy of it and there's an imagination that, well, for instance, the January 6th, the fact that so many of them were rounded up so quickly, there is big surveillance. Now they're all out. That kind of violence isn't there anymore. So I don't think there's other violence. I mean, even this afternoon, probably you saw the Marines arrived at the southern border, and I'm a subscriber to Truth Social because I cover this stuff, so I have to know. And you always get an alert. Usually one alert, Trump said something crazy. Don't you love it? 4 alerts with videos of the Marines thundering down to the southern border, right? That's the violence question right now, the violence of how far they're going to go and they're going to commit. The idea that there's any capacity for us to go to the border and contend with the Marines militarily, which I think some are thinking about, I think is distracting us from the work of imagining what we can do.
Right, or distracting us from the work of the kind of accountability journalism that you described. I mean, the military itself and DHS has said in the past that they have an extremism problem, that the military has a right-wing extremism problem, and 1/4 of the Border Patrol are veterans, are military veterans. CBP is the largest law enforcement agency in the world.
Which when we say 1/4 veteran, I always feel that qualifier because I was at an event with Jeff Toobin, the CNN talking head, and a man comes up and he says, look, I'm a veteran and I've been trying to organize amongst my community, progressive organizers. And I'm named after my uncle who was a founder of something, the GI Press, and was a veteran. And Toobin voiced liberalism, and I'm not saying you're saying that at all. I know you're not. I'm just sort of like, in case anyone's hearing it, because there's organizing. Toobin just responds, well, whatever percentage at January 6th were veterans. And the guy just said, I'm looking for help organizing progressively, right? So the accountability journalism you're talking about is looking what's there in the CBP and then saying, how is that constructed, right?
Right. It's not saying veteran equals right-wing extremists necessarily, but there is an extremism problem within both of those institutions. And part of it has to do with a lack of accountability. And I think that is a story that has been largely missed by the media. And those border deployments, for example, as soon as they happen, as soon as the photo op happens, people stop paying attention to them. There was also, unfortunately, an incredibly high rate of suicide and other incidents associated with that border deployment. And the media stopped paying attention. So more the point that I was trying to take from yours is I think I'm not going to touch the question of journalists and political violence. I mean, that just seems absurd to me. But in terms of an action and an action being more aggressive and more concerted in our efforts when it comes to accountability journalism, that accountability should be on both sides of the political aisle, regardless of who is in power. But to me, that's just an example of a story that I do think was missed. There's been a politicization of these institutions that are some of the most powerful in our country. And that politicization and that extremism has played out in ways that have real consequences.
But that's over now. That story is over now because extremism in the military is no longer an issue. That's now the chain of command. I mean, it really is. And another email I got this afternoon is from an organization, the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, and they just heard from one of their clients, an Annapolis grad, Navy Top Gun pilot, and now she's out. Her commander says, we're getting rid of you, women are leaving. And then he called an all-hands meeting and issued the 10 commandments of DEI. And that was an extremist. Now that's a man following orders. That's what I mean when I say our failure at accountability, and I'm saying ours is journalism, right? Now we have to pivot quickly and say, okay, what is the story we can do? Because extremism in the military, those Marines down at the border, they're just following orders now.
I've never covered the military, so I'm generally just asking, like, you're not worried about the reverse in that Hegseth is so extreme that there are people in the military who would break from his chain of command from the other side.
So I've been spending time covering Hegseth, who is probably, maybe someone has a phone, is probably our Secretary of Defense by now. That was supposed to happen this afternoon. And yes, that's one of the other worrisome things. And you see, again, folks tempted to this idea, well, I hope troops won't follow orders. That's a nuclear scenario. For a nuclear power to have one base commander saying, I'm not following orders, one, I'm not. I don't want them to follow orders. I don't want them to deploy domestically. I also don't want military units firing on each other. And that is the romance of the 19th century Civil War, which does not apply now. There haven't been any civil wars in a long time that anybody has won.
So we've got to wrap up. I really want to do this I love that this is getting a little bit more intense, and I want that to continue. I also want to steal the last word here before sending everyone off to dinner, and it's to come back to your example of Lydia Maria Child. And probably for most of us best remembered at this point as the person who edited and brought forth Harriet Jacobs' book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. What I immediately think of in that context is that book was originally supposed to be published by a tiny, brand new startup press that bears a lot of similarity to what we're thinking of now, that was a targeted book publisher called Thayer and Eldridge that was started in Boston in 1860. And the publishers, with this intention of doing quick responses to what was happening at the time, is mainly remembered because they published the first biography of John Brown. They published the first biography of Abraham Lincoln within weeks of Lincoln's surprise nomination. In the midst of doing all of that, they were also preparing books by Walt Whitman and books by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and bringing all of those people into their publishing offices where there were active conversations about this very issue. We are reaching a moment of an intolerable crossroads, and what do we do? And there were people in those rooms who decided that the solution was violence. And odd and strange now to think that Higginson, who we remember as being the leader of the 2nd South Carolina, and his book about his time in charge of that group of African-American troops, was an editor at The Atlantic at the time. And some of the other people who came down on the side of violence and support of John Brown were people like John Swinton at the New York Times and others. So what I can tell you is that for myself, as a Whitman guy, my tendency is to come down on the side of continuing to put more words on the page and continuing to find more ways of exploring the things that connect us and the things that bind us together, because it seems to me that violence, ultimately, that is the end of words. That's the point at which language has failed us. But I hope that over the next day and so, that we will find ways to talk about these information channels and trying to look at these historical examples and see what we can do to keep the conversation at the level of words and communication, even as I have to say I agree with Jeff that we are in the midst of something of a slow civil war that is starting to feel a bit faster every day. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper, Cass Ali, and Aaron Wald at Volubility Podcasting. Special thanks to the Church Studio.